I'm Jack Dempsey. Cameron just introduced me, vice chair to the study on to basically develop a strategy to renew federal facilities. I'll be handing over to Mike Imony here, the chair of the study here momentarily. Go back to, yep, thanks. But what's kind of neat is, all right, so all this stuff has to get done. How do you go about doing it? And that really ends up being kind of the focus of what the study was all about. But as a backdrop, and you've heard some of this before, facility management in the federal sector was really born in 1949. It was after the World War II build out, and now we're starting to figure out how we're going to be managing things. So in 1949, there was a Federal Property Administration Services Act, which started putting it on the map. A lot of work was done in trying to managing assets, getting things done. But it really wasn't until 1988, which is based on a lot of people taking a look at it, where I think the facility asset management idea really started coming together. And that was a report that was congressionally mandated. And it basically took a look around. So now we got all this infrastructure. How do we maintain it? Think about what's happening here. It's about 40 years after this major build out from World War II. So now things start to get old. And now we're starting to think about how do we not just build things, but how do we maintain things? And that report is pretty significant because it took a step back and started thinking about the meaning and value of these assets and how do we start making those investments. It wasn't long after that report when American Society of Civil Engineers and the report card, and then soon thereafter, GAO, which Keith just talked about in terms of the high risk report, starting to think like, well, let's start managing things and figuring out, are we making good investments and what can we do about doing that better? Along those times in kind of the mid 80s, GIPRA, the Government's Results Performance Act, came on scene. Right before that, the CFO Act. So some of these acts at that point in time, Clarence-Cohn was another one in terms of the IT, were really foundational in terms of modernizing the way the government worked, starting to think a little bit more business oriented, but it started pushing and advancing progression of thought process that we talk about in terms of facility asset management today. By extension, the maturing continued, ideas improved, systems and capabilities and the theory behind all that started really coalescing. And it's, we can target 2014, ISO 55000 system of standards was first published, and we've heard a little bit about that. A lot of people on the call know a lot about that. But I think at the time it wasn't like it was just a bright idea from left field that came in and said, hey, let's do this now. It was really in response to a demand in the marketplace. ISO standards serve the needs of improving commerce around the world. So they don't just write standards just to be theoretical. They're really writing standards in response to market demands. And at that time, the idea, and I think what we're seeing here is a progression of thoughts about asset management isn't just about coming up with strategies and figuring things out. It's actually, let's get systematic in that approach. And a couple of points we've heard is also, asset management really isn't about the asset, it's about the value generated by the assets. So in the continuation of where we are today, recently, OMB has been very active in this area, developing policies, OMB M20 TAC 03 and M20 TAC 10. DHS talked a little bit about how that's impacting their world, is starting to get kind of serious about this investment strategy. And I think now we're starting to look at, it's not just about asset management systems and being able to do the trade-offs, plan versus actual, things like that, having good inventory, having confidence in your data. It's now starting to figure out how do we apply all that capability and develop strategies. What is our asset management strategies moving forward? So if we go to the next slide real quick. Today, what it's identified here in the slide, won't go into the details, is probably the 4 seminal documents in the federal sector, federal facility asset management, that defines basically the current policies on how you apply asset management. And it's OMB Circular A11, particularly the capital programming guide, which starts talking about investments and decision-making along those lines. Another one, very importantly, and kind of coming on scene with a lot of momentum, is OMB Circular A123, the recent updates on that started focusing on enterprise risk management and management controls. And a lot of what Cameron talked about is really kind of like how do you get into that decision-making process, and how do you have confidence and assurance that the decisions you're making are in balance with all the competing needs and interests. And that circular used to be more kind of the CFO's groundwork, but today it's been expressly expanded to include effectively all C-suite activities. And Mr. Burgess, who was talking about things that are going on in DHS, I think is a reflection of these changes that are happening. Most recently, OMB M20 Tech 03, in terms of the implementation of agency-wide real property capital planning, which is complemented by M20 Tech 10, which is really the continuation of the freeze the footprint, reduce the footprint energy. So there is a national strategy that's starting to pull it together, but that document, is recent as it is, and it's not, I think, 6 months old or something like that, is basically saying this is a starting point for really starting to pull that together. So that's the landscape that we're working with, and that was really kind of the run up to this strategy.